So here's a question. What's your style when you're designing and facilitating workshops? Your preferred style? I first saw this model, Dr. Bailey Jackson from UMass Amherst. He was doing a train the trainer. He asked us, so are you more of an activist when you're designing and facilitating workshops? Is that the style you're coming out of? And you're kind of an activist. It's like, this is what we're about. We got to get people moving, change. I believe I'm an activist inside, and as I show up, I am educating, sharing information, tools and skills, skill development, and also facilitating, which is really interesting. I didn't add that one, and I don't think I can now, but I'll add it. It'll be farther down. I was so clear that that's what I do, I forgot to add it. So you can, in the chat, if you're referencing that. So, is your primary style when you're not paying attention, when you're feeling good, an activist, facilitator, which for me is engaging others, activities that they engage, and you might ask questions and you're facilitating learning, but the people themselves are the source of the learning, a lot of it, with your activities? Are you an educator where you are sharing some information, there's engagement? Again, these are a lot of overlap, but I want you to find the language that works for you. Are you a presenter? And for me, what that means is, PowerPoint or Keynote, it's pretty much just one-way communication, whereas educator, there's dialogue and engagement and reflective questions. The word teacher, maybe how you name yourself, and that may be similar to what I've already said, but again, that might be the language. And this morning when I was coaching someone, I added counselor and coach, that your style might be facilitator-ish, and yet you may have a counselor and or coach part of you. So the reason I'm offering it is I think it's useful for us to reflect ourselves as well as with others we co-facilitate with, or if we have a supervisor, to really reflect, wow, what is my style? And how effective is it in different settings? And do I have the capacity to move back and forth? If folks are not getting privileged and marginalized dynamics, would doing the playing card activity be useful? Or would a 5-minute story of when I'm in privileged groups and marginalized groups? Or would an input piece of the concept and charting it, or give people an activity to do? So we're trying to get skill building, awareness building, results that people can then make differences in their environments, create greater inclusion. How we teach, develop what people need as well as what's our style, and sometimes we can get that nice balance. And so my question for you all is to reflect, when you are centered, what's your style? How would you describe how you do training? And then the next question for me is, when you're triggered, what's your style and your default, and how effective are you? When I'm triggered, I can get into activist, and this has to be done, or we have to organize. And I find myself much more expressively passionate. I get a little more directive and insistent. And that can be very useful in some settings. In the settings I'm often in, if there's a wide range of capacity and willingness, then the folks that are more into social justice might love it, and the folks that are still feeling scared and not very competent may feel put off. And so again, I'm not saying there's a right or wrong, but to be choiceful what we're doing in the moment. And I go into teacher mode when I'm feeling triggered, when I'm feeling I don't have enough time, somebody's questioning my competence, folks aren't, quote, getting it the way I think they should. I'm afraid things will get out of control. So all those dynamics, as you looked at the Navigating Difficult Situations webinars, if you're there yet in kind of the 3rd or 4th month, some of those intrapersonal roots that get re-triggered. And so I am a little out of my body, and I react as an automatic pilot instead of a thoughtful choice of what style, what activity, what in question would be useful. Now, another way to think about this is when you feel triggered. I just made this up literally 5 minutes ago. I remember there was a leadership styles inventory that kind of went from telling and selling, and then I don't remember the other ones, so I made up these. So when you feel triggered, Do you go into telling? Because when I say teacher, that's kind of what I mean. That I go into telling. This is the way it is. This is what we need to do. This is what I believe. This is what I think is going on. And there might be reasons to have pieces of that, but generally in the type of workshops I'm encouraging you to think about, given where I think the culture and climate is in predominantly white organizations, telling mode, particularly in our privileged identities, is usually not very effective. People will resist. If I start telling whites they have racist behaviors, if I start telling organizations it's a racist organizations, usually I'll get pushback. There are other ways to get the outcome, usually without a telling mode when I'm triggered. Again, this is different from an intentional short lecturette. You want to teach about X. I still think there could be ways people do an engagement or a dyad so they get involved as learners before you then offer them the concept. But that's just my personal preference of learning that I have believed over the years is working. So this one, when you're triggered, you go into telling, which I do. I also find sometimes I'm selling. If I'm offering an idea and I'm in a coaching relationship and they seem to resist, then I might say, well, it's a really good idea because, or I do it and here's why I find it useful. Now, selling can be useful, and yet people might be not engaging or resisting. And so if I'm just telling or selling, it's just more push, and they're going to maybe not be hearing. And I could be wrong. So I think explaining is a little different than selling, but it's pretty close. Sometimes when I feel triggered and I'm facilitating, if I'm called out on my behavior, I'll go into the perfectly logical explanation. That was my intent. My intent wasn't that. I didn't want to have that impact. I'm not a bad person, so I might start explaining away what happened, or explaining why I think people need to do something. Wondering, as we get to more of the skills you see I'm teaching here in this course, I tend to overemphasize the wondering. I'm curious. I'm noticing this is going on in the group. I'm wondering what's going on. I felt the energy shift just then. Curious what's going on. I noticed you raised your voice, wondering what's going on. So a wondering intervention question. I'm noticing I'm feeling a bit triggered. I'm wondering if anybody else is. When I enter wondering, I usually have better learning results, achieving group development, engagement, dialogue. Usually happens sooner, faster, more effective. And that's related to asking questions. The wondering is kind of a question, and then there are other kinds of questions which you have or will see in lots of the materials, especially as you look at the skill of pairs. Asking questions, there's a ton in the navigating difficult situations work. So, and then listening, I added today as a thought that maybe an intervention is, the question might be, tell me more, or you don't even have to ask a question. You just sit back and listen. You feel that triggered energy to want to come in. And instead you pause and just say, let me keep listening and understanding and see what else emerges. So I at least wanted to offer these two ways of thinking about initially when you're feeling centered or you're unconscious and you just are kind of in your natural habitual way of being. In general, activist, facilitator, educator, presenter, teacher, coach, counselor, and whatever words. If you have co-facilitators, ask that question with each other, have that conversation. And then when you're triggered, is there a style you move into? And another way to think about that, telling, selling, explaining, wondering, asking questions, listening, could be a helpful follow-up with asking for feedback from people who have been in your workshops, people who have experienced you triggered, and getting some feedback and asking in that moment, what could I have done differently, do you think, that might have been more useful in that moment? And clearly, if you're doing a train the trainer with folks, these are two questions that I think could be useful.